The roses were just starting to bloom when she appeared at my gate, the woman who had destroyed my entire world 35 years ago. I was watering the bed by the fence when I saw her, an old woman leaning on a walker, two men holding her steady. Her face was lined and soft, but something in the way she held herself made my chest tighten. She took a step forward. Then she said my name. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard like a stone dropping into still water. I didn't move. I couldn't. She took another step and the sunlight caught her face. That's when I saw it. The shape of her mouth, the way her brows drew together. And I knew. I didn't know my body could still feel that kind of shock after so many years. She stopped a few feet away. Her hands were shaking on the walker's handles. She told me who she was. She said her son's name, David. The hose slipped from my fingers. Water pooled at my feet. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. I'd buried it so deep I thought it no longer had the power to hurt me. But hearing it now brought everything rushing back. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The memory hit me all at once. 35 years ago, I was 25. Young, hopeful, so completely in love I thought nothing could touch us. David and I had been together for 3 years. We'd spend hours talking about the life we'd build. A small house with a porch, a garden where we'd grow tomatoes and sunflowers, children who'd run barefoot in the grass. He'd hold my hand in the dark and tell me we'd make it work, no matter what anyone thought. When I found out I was pregnant, I cried, not from fear, but from a kind of overwhelming joy I'd never felt before. I remember sitting on the edge of the bathtub staring at the test, feeling like my whole life was about to begin. David smiled when I told him. He kissed my forehead, my cheeks, my hands. He told me we were ready, that this was what we'd been waiting for. We decided to tell his parents together. We wanted to do it right, to stand side by side and ask for their blessing before we got married. I wore a pale yellow dress that day. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely button it. David held them steady in the car. He told me not to worry. He told me his parents would come around. We walked into their house hand in hand. His mother was sitting on the sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. His father stood by the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. David cleared his throat. He told them we wanted to get married. He told them we were in love. He told them we were ready to start our lives together. His mother didn't smile. She didn't say congratulations. She just looked at me, her expression cold and smooth as glass, and told us we weren't suitable for their family. I felt David's hand tighten around mine. He told her I was pregnant. There was a long silence. His mother's face didn't change. She looked at me the way you'd look at something you were trying to get rid of. She said the child couldn't be theirs. The words didn't make sense at first. I just stood there, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a mistake, to take it back. But no one did. David's father spoke then. His voice was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't leave room for argument. He told David that if he stayed with me, he'd be cut off. No inheritance, no family, no support of any kind. I looked at David. I waited for him to say something, to defend me, to tell them we didn't need their money or their approval, to choose us. But he didn't. His hand slipped out of mine, slowly, like he was letting go of something fragile he'd been holding too tightly. What I heard next made everything I'd buried rise back to the surface. He stepped back, just one step, but it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. His mother stood and walked to the door. She opened it without looking at me again. She told me to leave. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering so loud I thought they could hear it. I kept waiting for David to move, to say he was coming with me, to tell them they were wrong, but he just stood there, his face pale, his eyes on the floor. I walked out alone. The street outside was quiet. The evening air was cool against my skin. I kept thinking he'd follow me, that any second I'd hear his footsteps behind me, feel his hand on my shoulder, hear him say he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, that he was choosing me, but he never came. I sat down on a bench at a bus stop and cried until I couldn't breathe. For 2 months after that, I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was drifting through my own life, watching it happen to someone else. I stopped going to my classes. I couldn't concentrate. Every time I tried to think about the future, all I saw was a blank wall. I found work washing dishes at a diner on the edge of town. The pay was barely enough to cover rent on a tiny studio apartment, but it was something. My hands were raw and red by the end of every shift, my back aching, but I kept showing up. I didn't have anywhere else to be. Robert entered my life during the darkest stretch of those early months. He was 20 years older, gentle in a quiet way, and he accepted my pregnancy without a single question or hesitation. What grew between us wasn't romance, but safety, a steady place to land when I had none. He gave my daughter a name, a home, and a father who showed up for every school play and every small milestone. We shared a house, not a love story, but there was kindness in every year we spent together. He never asked for more than I could give, and when he passed 8 years ago, the silence he left behind was softer than the life he helped rebuild for me. I never told him how much he saved me. I wish I had. Now, standing in my garden with water still dripping from the roses, I stared at the woman who had taken everything from me. She looked so much older than I remembered, smaller, fragile in a way I hadn't expected. One of the men beside her cleared his throat. He told me they'd driven a long way, that she had something she needed to say. I didn't move. David's mother stepped forward, leaning heavily on her walker. Her hands were trembling. She looked up at me, and I saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. She told me David was dying. I thought I was prepared for the truth. I wasn't. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. She said he'd been bedridden for 3 months, that the doctors had done everything they could, but it wasn't enough, that he'd been calling my name, over and over, in his sleep, when he was awake, in the middle of the night when the nurses thought he was unconscious. Only my name. She paused, her breath shallow and uneven. She asked if I'd see him, just once, before he was gone. Even after I closed the door, something in me refused to let it end there. I looked at her for a long time. I thought about the girl I'd been, standing in that living room with David's hand in mine. I thought about all the nights I'd spent wondering if he ever thought of me, if he remembered my face, if he regretted what he'd done. I told her no. Her face crumpled like paper. She sank to her knees right there in the wet grass, her walker tipping sideways. One of the men tried to lift her, but she waved him off with a shaking hand. She begged. She said she knew what she'd done, that she couldn't take it back, that she'd been wrong. But he was her son, and he was dying, and all he wanted was to see me one last time. I felt something crack deep inside my chest, but I didn't let it show on my face. I told her she'd made her choice 35 years ago, that she didn't get to ask me for anything now. I turned and walked into the house. I locked the door behind me and stood in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. I didn't look back, but at night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, I'd hear her voice. "He's been calling your name." I'd close my eyes and see David the way he was back then, young, smiling, full of promises he never kept, but I also saw him stepping back, letting me go, choosing safety over love, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two versions of him. I didn't realize until I was standing in that dim hallway that I'd been carrying him all along. On the 8th day, I woke up before dawn. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and stared at the crumpled piece of paper David's mother had left by my gate. The address was 3 hours away. I got dressed slowly. I put on a pale blue cardigan and my good shoes. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even know if I'd go through with it. but I got in the car. The drive was long and quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. When I pulled up to the house, I sat in the car for 10 minutes, staring at the front door. What he had been waiting 35 years to say would break something open in me. It was a large house. Neat, expensive, cold-looking. The kind of place that felt like it belonged in a magazine, not like a home where anyone actually lived. A nurse met me at the door. She didn't ask who I was. She just nodded and led me upstairs without a word. David's room was at the end of the hall. The door was half open. Inside, the curtains were drawn, and the light was dim and gray. He was lying in the bed, propped up slightly on pillows. His face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, his skin pale as paper. His breathing was shallow, labored, each breath a small effort. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at him. He didn't look like the man I remembered, but I could still see him there. In the shape of his jaw, in the way his hair fell across his forehead, in the curve of his hands resting on the blanket. I stepped inside. He didn't open his eyes right away, but his hand twitched slightly, like some part of him knew someone was there. I sat down in the chair beside the bed. The cushion was worn and soft, like someone had been sitting there for weeks. I said his name, quietly, just once. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, hazy, searching. Then they found me, and he started to cry. Silent, slow tears that rolled down his cheeks and disappeared into the pillow. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold and thin, the bones sharp beneath the skin, but I held it gently. I told him I forgave him. He tried to speak. His lips moved, forming shapes that might have been words, but no sound came out. His throat worked, his eyes desperate, but his voice was gone. I leaned closer. I told him it was okay, that he didn't have to say anything. I told him about Sophia. I said she was strong and kind and full of life, that she had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and that they were beautiful and bright and everything he would have loved if he'd had the chance to know them. His tears came faster. I stayed for 10 minutes, maybe 15. I didn't say much else. I just sat there, holding his hand, letting him know I was there, that I'd come. When I stood to leave, he squeezed my fingers. It was barely a pressure at all, just the faintest tightening of his grip, but I felt it. I walked out of the room without looking back. 2 days later, his mother called. Her voice was quiet, tired, emptied of everything but the simple fact she needed to tell me. She said he'd passed that morning. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. That night, I sat in my garden, in the same spot where she'd appeared a week before. The roses were fuller now, their petals soft and heavy in the fading light. The air was cool, and somewhere down the street I could hear children laughing. For the first time in 35 years, my mind was quiet. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't carrying him with me the way I used to, like a weight I couldn't set down. The silence in my mind wasn't emptiness. It was peace, the kind I'd been too afraid to let in. I'd forgiven him, not because he deserved it, not because what he did was okay, but because I deserved to be free. Have you ever forgiven someone? Not for them, but for yourself?